The mud still clung to wagon wheels like thick molasses, and the air hung heavy with the scent of rotting hay and standing water. 3 days had passed since the Kansas River had swollen beyond its banks, turning the weekly market in Lawrence into a soggy mess of damaged goods and desperate sellers. Steam rose from the wet earth as the October sun fought through gray clouds, casting everything in a pale, sickly light. Ezra Hutchins spat tobacco juice into a puddle and adjusted his suspenders. "Ain't much of a market today," he muttered to no one in particular, eyeing the sparse crowd picking through water-stained flour sacks and rusted tools. The flood had taken more than just crops this year. It had taken hope right along with it. That's when the rickety wagon rolled into the square. The mule pulling it looked about as worn down as the contraption itself, all jutting ribs and drooping head. But it wasn't the sorry state of the animal or the wagon that made folks stop their haggling and turn to stare. It was what sat in the back. A woman, maybe 25 or so, perched on what appeared to be a makeshift wheeled chair constructed from barrel hoops and salvaged wood. Her dark hair hung loose and tangled around her shoulders, and she clutched a thin quilt to her chest like it was the only thing keeping her anchored to this world. Her face was gaunt, hollowed by hunger or grief or both. But her eyes, Lord, her eyes held something that made a man look twice. Not pleading, not broken, just watching. The driver was a different story altogether. Jebediah Morse had the look of a man who'd found religion in the bottom of a whiskey bottle and lost it again just as quick. His clothes reeked of sweat and worse things. And when he climbed down from the wagon seat, he did so with the careful movements of someone nursing a powerful headache. "Gather round, folks," Jebediah called out, his voice carrying the forced cheer of a snake oil salesman. "Got something here needs taking care of, real gentle-like, you understand." Mrs. Abernathy, the banker's wife, clutched her reticule tighter and whispered something sharp to her husband. The blacksmith, Tom Bradley, wiped his hands on his leather apron and stepped closer, curiosity getting the better of his common sense. "What you got there, Morse?" Bradley asked, though his eyes were already fixed on the woman in the wagon. Jebediah gestured toward his cargo with a sweep of his arm that nearly sent him stumbling. "This here's Clara, my late brother's widow. Real sweet girl, but—" He lowered his voice to a stage whisper that carried clear across the square. "Flood took her husband and left her legs no good. Can't work, can't tend house proper. Been a burden on my family for nigh on 2 months now." Clara Whitmore, for that had been her name before the river changed everything, kept her gaze fixed on something far beyond the gathering crowd. She didn't flinch when Jebediah spoke of her like she was livestock, didn't protest when he listed her limitations like items on a ledger. She just sat there, straight-backed despite everything, and waited. "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Morse?" This from Reverend Fletcher, who'd pushed through the crowd with the self-important air of a man accustomed to being consulted on matters of Christian charity. "Well, Reverend, I figure someone in this fine community might have use for an extra pair of hands. Clara here. She's got her wits about her. Can sew a fine seam, cook when she's got the fixings. Might be she could earn her keep with the right family." The crowd murmured among themselves, but it wasn't the kind of murmuring that suggested anyone was reaching for their purse strings. Tom Bradley scratched his beard and looked uncomfortable. Mrs. Abernathy had already started steering her husband away from the spectacle. A few of the younger men snickered behind their hands, making jokes that weren't quite loud enough to be called out but weren't quiet enough to be missed. "Seems to me," said old Pete Williamson, leaning heavily on his walking stick, "a woman in her condition might be better served by the county poorhouse. They got folks there trained for such things." "Poorhouse is full up," Jebediah replied quickly. "Flood saw to that. Besides, Clara here's got breeding. Came from good stock before she married my brother. Educated, too. Can read and write and cipher numbers." He was selling her. Clara realized with a detached sort of clarity. Maybe not for coin, but selling her all the same. trading her off to whoever would take the burden of her care in exchange for whatever small services she might provide. She'd known this day would come, had felt it creeping closer with every meal she couldn't contribute to, every chore she couldn't complete, every time Jebediah's wife looked at her with barely concealed resentment. The crowd was starting to disperse when a voice cut through the October air like a blade. "I'll take her." Every head turned toward the speaker. He stood apart from the main group, had been there the whole time, though few had noticed him. Tall and lean, with sun-weathered skin and hair the color of wheat stubble. His clothes were clean, but well-worn, the kind of practical garments a man wore when he had work to do and no one to impress. He wore a gun belt, but then most men did. What set him apart was the way he carried himself, like he was used to being alone and preferred it that way. "That so?" Jebediah's eyes lit up with the prospect of an easy solution. "Well now, Mr. Rowan, Elias Rowan." Clara knew that name. Everyone in Lawrence County knew it. The man who'd bought the old Hutchins place after the fire and turned it into something resembling a working ranch. Kept to himself mostly. Came to town only when necessity demanded it. Paid his bills on time and never caused trouble. Which in these parts was recommendation enough. "You sure about this, Rowan?" Pete Williamson asked. "Woman like that. She'll need considerable care. Might be more than one man can handle." Elias Rowan's gray eyes swept over the crowd before settling on Clara. For the first time since arriving at the market, she met someone's gaze directly. Something passed between them. Not pity, not charity, but a kind of recognition that neither could have put into words. "I reckon I can manage," Elias said simply. Jebediah was already rubbing his hands together, eager to close the deal before anyone changed their mind. "Well then, that's settled. Clara, you gather your things now, mister. Rowan's being real generous, taking you on like this." But Clara wasn't looking at Jebediah anymore. She was still watching Elias Rowan, trying to read something in his weathered features. He stepped closer to the wagon, and she tensed slightly. Not with fear, exactly, but with the wariness of someone who'd learned not to trust easy kindness. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat, "if you're agreeable, I've got a wagon that'll ride easier than this one, and a place ready for you at my ranch." It wasn't a question, but it wasn't a command either. Somehow, in those few words, he'd managed to give her a choice that no one else had offered. Clara nodded once, a small movement that carried the weight of surrender and hope in equal measure. As Elias helped transfer her few possessions, a worn carpet bag, the quilt, and the makeshift chair, to his own wagon, the crowd began to break up. The excitement was over. The entertainment concluded. They had their own troubles to worry about, their own damaged goods to peddle. But Clara caught the whispers as people walked away. "Shame, really. Poor thing. Rowan's taking on more than he knows. Give it a month before he brings her back." Elias Rowan heard them too, as he settled Clara into the bed of his wagon, arranging her chair beside her and making sure the quilt was tucked securely around her legs. He spoke quietly, just loud enough for her to hear. "They don't know you yet," he said. "That's their loss, not yours." Then he climbed onto the wagon seat, clicked his tongue to the horses, and drove Clara Whitmore away from the market square toward whatever uncertain future awaited them both. The ride to Elias Rowan's ranch passed in near silence, broken only by the steady creak of wagon wheels and the soft snorting of horses. Clara kept her hands folded in her lap, watching the landscape roll by, brown grass bent low by recent rains, fence posts standing like lonely sentinels, and in the distance, the dark line of cottonwoods that marked where Willow Creek cut through the prairie. Elias drove with the easy confidence of a man who knew every rut and stone in the road. Occasionally he'd point out a landmark, the old Hendricks place where lightning had struck the barn, the grove where wild plums grew thick in summer, but he didn't seem to expect conversation. Clara found herself grateful for that. Words felt like luxuries she couldn't afford right now. The ranch house appeared gradually, emerging from a shallow valley like something that had grown up from the earth itself rather than been built upon it. It was modest but well maintained, with a wide front porch and windows that caught the afternoon light. Smoke curled from the chimney, and Clara could see a vegetable garden laid out in neat rows beside the house, though the recent flood had left it looking bedraggled. "Built it myself," Elias said as they approached. "Took the better part of 3 years, working evenings and Sundays. Nothing fancy, but it's solid." He pulled the wagon up close to the front steps and set the brake. For a moment, neither of them moved. Clara stared at the house, her new home, she supposed, though the word felt strange and uncertain in her mind. Elias sat quietly beside her, giving her time to absorb what she was seeing. "There's a room prepared for you," he said finally. "Ground floor, so you won't have trouble with stairs. I moved some furniture around this morning." This morning, that meant he'd been planning to bring someone home even before he'd spoken up at the market. The thought unsettled her, not because she suspected any ill intent, but because it suggested a level of consideration she hadn't expected. Elias climbed down and came around to help her from the wagon. He handled her chair with the same quiet efficiency he'd shown everything else, unfolding it and positioning it beside the wagon bed. When he lifted her down, his hands were gentle but matter-of-fact, as if helping an invalid woman from a wagon was something he did every day. The inside of the house was as unpretentious as the outside. Clean plank floors, simple furniture, everything built for function rather than show. But it was warm, and it smelled like wood smoke and coffee rather than the sour odors that had permeated Jebediah's place. "Your room's just here," Elias said, guiding her chair through a doorway off the main living area. Clara's breath caught slightly. The room was small but comfortable, with a narrow bed pushed against one wall and a simple washstand beneath the single window. A quilt, not fancy, but clean and well-mended, was spread across the mattress. An oil lamp sat on the small table beside the bed, its reservoir full and wick trimmed. Most surprising of all, someone had built a wooden ramp leading from the doorway down to the slightly sunken floor, making the room accessible to her chair. "I had to guess at what you might need," Elias said, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty for the first time since she'd met him. "If something's not right, we can change it." Clara wheeled herself slowly around the room, taking in the details. A wooden crate had been turned on its side to serve as a makeshift dresser. A pitcher and basin sat ready on the washstand. Even the height of the bed seemed calculated to make transferring from her chair as easy as possible. "It's—" she began, then stopped. She'd been about to say perfect, but that seemed like too much. "It's very thoughtful. Thank you." Elias nodded and stepped back toward the doorway. "I'll bring your things in. There's fresh water in the pitcher, and I set out some soap and towels. Kitchen's through that way when you're ready for something to eat." After he left, Clara sat alone in the quiet room, trying to make sense of what had happened to her. This morning she'd been cargo in Jebediah's wagon, a burden to be disposed of. Now she was— what? A guest? A charity case? She wasn't sure, but whatever this arrangement was, it felt different from anything she'd experienced since the flood. She moved to the window and looked out across the ranch yard. Elias was unhitching the horses, moving with the unhurried precision of someone accustomed to working alone. As she watched, he glanced toward her window, and their eyes met briefly before he returned to his work. That evening, Clara discovered that Elias had meant what he said about the kitchen. He'd prepared a simple meal, beans and cornbread, coffee that was strong but not bitter, and set 2 places at the small wooden table. But when she wheeled herself into the main room, she found her plate waiting on a tray. "Thought you might prefer to eat in your room tonight," he said without looking up from his own meal. "Been a long day." It was an escape he was offering. She realized a chance to avoid the awkwardness of sharing a table with a stranger, of trying to make conversation when she had no idea what her place in this house was supposed to be. But instead of taking the tray, Clara maneuvered her chair up to the table. "I've eaten alone for 2 months," she said quietly. "I'd prefer some company, if you don't mind." Elias looked up, surprised. Then he smiled, just a slight upturn at the corners of his mouth. But it transformed his entire face. "I'd like that," he said. They ate mostly in silence, but it was a comfortable quiet, broken occasionally by Elias asking if she needed anything or Clara commenting on the food. It wasn't until they'd finished eating that she noticed the small bundle of fabric beside her plate. "What's this?" she asked. "Found it in my mother's things," Elias said, suddenly looking uncomfortable. "Thought you might have use for it." Clara unfolded the bundle carefully. It was a handkerchief, clearly well made but showing its age. In one corner, embroidered in fading blue thread, was the letter E. "It's beautiful," Clara said, running her fingers over the delicate stitching. "But this was your mother's. You should keep it." "Had it for 10 years now, since she passed. Never seemed right for me to carry it." Elias stood and began clearing the dishes. "Figure she'd be pleased to see it put to proper use again. Besides," he added, glancing back at her, "I thought you should have something of your own here. Something that wasn't borrowed or given out of obligation." Clara held the handkerchief to the lamplight, studying the careful needlework. It was such a small thing, but it carried weight beyond its size. In giving it to her, Elias was saying something, not about charity or pity, but about belonging, about having a place. "Thank you," she said, and meant it in ways that went far beyond the gift itself. Over the following days, they settled into a routine that surprised Clara with its naturalness. Elias would rise before dawn to tend the animals and see to the heavier chores. Clara would wake to find breakfast waiting on the kitchen table. Never elaborate, but always filling. He'd leave for the day's work without ceremony, but he'd made sure she had everything she needed within reach. At first, Clara spent most of her time in her room, uncertain of her boundaries in this new place. But gradually, she began to venture into the other parts of the house. She discovered that Elias was a meticulous housekeeper, everything in its place. Surfaces clean, firewood stacked neatly beside the hearth. The house showed the care of someone who took pride in his surroundings, even if no one else was there to see them. On the 4th morning, Clara found herself wheeling out onto the front porch as Elias was finishing his morning chores. He was mending a section of fence near the barn, his movements economical and sure. When he noticed her watching, he straightened and touched his hat brim in greeting. "Morning, Miss Clara," he called across the yard. "Good morning, Mr. Rowan," she called back. It became their daily ritual, a simple exchange of greetings that marked the beginning of each day. Nothing profound, but it was theirs, and it mattered. On the 5th day, Elias approached the porch where Clara sat watching the sunrise paint the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold. "Might be you'd like to see more of the place," he said. "I could hitch up the wagon, show you around the property." Clara considered this. She'd been content to observe from a distance, but the offer was tempting. "I wouldn't want to take you from your work." "Work'll keep. Besides," Elias said, and Clara caught that hint of a smile again. "I could use the company. Gets quiet out here, talking to nothing but horses and cattle all day." As they rode slowly around the boundaries of his land, Elias pointed out the improvements he'd made. A new well, a corral he'd expanded, pasture land he'd cleared and seeded. It was clear that this place was more than just property to him. It was a vision he was bringing to life, acre by acre, season by season. "Must get lonely," Clara observed as they paused on a small rise overlooking the creek. "Sometimes," Elias admitted. "But there's peace in it, too. Nobody expecting things from you that you can't give. Nobody disappointed when you fall short." Clara understood that sentiment better than he might have guessed. There was safety in solitude, in having no one to let down but yourself. As they headed back toward the house, Clara found herself studying Elias's profile. the strong line of his jaw, the way his eyes constantly scanned the horizon, the careful way he handled the reins. He was a good man, she thought. Not perfect, perhaps, but good in the way that mattered. And for reasons she couldn't quite name, that realization made her feel something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. The morning came crisp and clear, with the kind of October light that made even the humblest things seem touched with gold. Clara had taken to positioning her chair near the front window during breakfast, watching Elias go about his morning routine. There was something soothing about the predictability of it, the way he moved from barn to chicken coop to well, each task completed with quiet efficiency. On this particular morning, she noticed him pause at the vegetable garden, hands on his hips as he surveyed the flood damage. Most of the late crops had been ruined. The neat rows now a tangle of yellowed leaves and broken stems. He stood there for a long moment, as if calculating something in his head, then walked toward the house. "Miss Clara?" His voice carried through the open window. "Might I have a word?" She wheeled herself onto the porch, curious. Elias stood at the bottom of the steps, his hat in his hands. A gesture she'd learned meant he was working up to saying something important. "I was thinking about the garden," he began. "Most of it's a loss, but there's still time to plant winter vegetables, turnips, carrots, maybe some late cabbage." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Wondered if you might have an interest in helping with it." Clara felt something stir in her chest. Surprise, perhaps, or something more complicated. "I'm not sure how much help I'd be." "More than you might think." Elias stepped closer, his voice taking on the tone he used when explaining ranch work. "Most of gardening's about knowing when and where and how much. The doing part, well, that can be figured out." The idea both intrigued and intimidated her. Before the flood. She'd kept a small kitchen garden behind the cabin she'd shared with her husband Matthew. Nothing fancy, but she'd taken pride in coaxing vegetables from the stubborn Kansas soil. Since the accident, she'd assumed such things were beyond her now. "I could try," she said finally, "though I might need some accommodating." "That's what I was hoping you'd say." Elias replaced his hat and smiled. "Let me show you what I had in mind." What he had in mind, it turned out, was a series of raised beds built at a height that would allow Clara to reach them from her chair. Over the next few days, she watched him work in the evenings after his regular chores were done, constructing wooden frames and filling them with good soil mixed with composted manure from the barn. "You don't have to do all this for me," Clara protested on the second evening, feeling guilty about the extra work. "Not doing it for you," Elias replied, not looking up from the frame he was assembling. "Doing it for us. Garden's going to feed both of us through winter. And I'm not much of a hand with vegetables. Cattle and horses, that's what I know. But greens and such," he shrugged. "Could use someone who understands them." It was a kindness disguised as practicality, and Clara recognized it as such. But there was truth in what he said, too. She did understand gardens, and the prospect of having useful work to do sent a warmth through her that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. When the beds were finished, Elias brought her a small wooden crate filled with seed packets, turnips, radishes, lettuce, carrots, onions. Clara handled each packet carefully, reading the faded print and calculating planting times in her head. "These are good choices for fall planting," she said, "though we'll need to get them in the ground soon if we want to harvest before hard frost." "Then I reckon we'd better get started." Working together in the garden proved easier than Clara had expected. Elias followed her directions without question, digging furrows to her specifications and spacing them according to her instructions. She handled the delicate work, placing seeds at precise intervals, covering them with just the right amount of soil, marking each row with small wooden stakes. "Not too deep with the radish seeds," she cautioned as Elias prepared the next row. "They're small. Half an inch is plenty." "Yes, ma'am." There was no trace of impatience in his voice, no suggestion that he found her instructions burdensome. He simply did what she asked, trusting her knowledge as completely as she was learning to trust his. The work was slow but satisfying. Clara found herself concentrating so fully on the task at hand that she forgot, for long stretches, about the limitations that had come to define her life. Her hands remembered the feel of soil, the weight of seeds, the careful pressure needed to firm the earth without compacting it. For the first time since the flood, she felt truly useful. "Hand me that packet of carrot seeds," she said, holding out her palm. Elias placed the packet in her hand, and she poured a small portion of the tiny seeds into her palm. They were so small, so unpromising, yet each one carried the potential for life and growth and nourishment. "Amazing, isn't it?" she said, almost to herself. "How something so small can become something so essential." Elias paused in his digging and looked at her. "Reckon that's true of most worthwhile things. Start small, need the right conditions, take time to grow." There was something in his tone that made Clara look up from the seeds. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Thoughtful, perhaps, or hopeful. Their eyes met for a moment before he returned to his work, but the weight of that look stayed with her. As the days passed, their morning routine expanded to include checking the garden together. Clara would wheel out to inspect the raised beds while Elias saw to the livestock, and they'd meet to discuss what needed doing. The first green shoots appeared within a week, tiny but unmistakable signs of life pushing through the dark soil. "Look at that," Clara said one morning, her voice bright with satisfaction. "The radishes are coming up already." Elias crouched beside her chair to get a better look at the delicate green leaves. "How long before they're ready to eat?" 6 weeks, maybe 8 if the weather turns cold early. Clara reached out to gently brush a speck of soil from one of the emerging leaves. "The turnips will take a bit longer, but they'll keep better through winter." "You know a lot about this," Elias observed. "Where'd you learn it?" "My mother, mostly. She had the finest garden in 3 counties back in Missouri. Said a woman who could grow her own food would never go hungry, no matter what else went wrong." Clara's voice softened with memory. Turned out she was wrong about that, but not about the satisfaction of it. Elias was quiet for a moment, watching her tend to the young plants. "She sounds like a wise woman." "She was—" Wish she could see this. Clara gestured at the neat rows of emerging vegetables. "She'd be pleased to know I remembered her lessons." "Maybe she can see it," Elias said quietly. "Maybe she's pleased you're using what she taught you." It was such a simple thing to say, but it hit Clara with unexpected force. She'd been so focused on what she'd lost, her husband, her home, the use of her legs, that she'd forgotten to consider what remained. Her knowledge, her skills, her ability to nurture life from soil and seed. These things the flood hadn't touched. The garden became a daily source of both work and wonder. Clara found herself rising earlier each morning, eager to check on their progress. She taught Elias how to thin the radish seedlings to give the remaining plants room to grow, how to tell when the lettuce was ready for its first cutting, how to bank earth around the turnip plants to keep the roots sweet. "You're enjoying this," Elias observed one afternoon as they worked side by side, harvesting the season's first batch of crisp radishes. Clara paused, a handful of the bright red roots in her palm. "I am," she said, surprised by the realization. "I'd forgotten what it felt like to be good at something." "You're good at more than gardening," Elias said matter-of-factly. "You've got a way of making things better just by being present for them." The comment caught Clara off guard. She looked at him sharply, wondering if she'd heard correctly. But his attention was focused on the carrots he was carefully unearthing. "I don't know about that," she said. "I do." Elias straightened, brushing soil from his hands. "House feels different with you in it. More like a home than just a place to sleep." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. Such direct honesty was unusual for Elias, and she wasn't sure how to respond. "You've been very kind to me, Mr. Rowan, kinder than I had any right to expect." "Name's Elias," he said, not for the first time. And kindness doesn't have much to do with it. You've earned your place here. The words settled into Clara's heart like seeds finding fertile ground. Earned her place. Not been given charity, not been tolerated out of Christian duty, but earned. The distinction mattered more than she could have explained. That evening, as they sat at the kitchen table sharing a meal that included their own fresh radishes and lettuce, Clara found herself stealing glances at Elias. He ate with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything else, but there was a contentment about him that hadn't been there when she first arrived. The lines around his eyes seemed softer, and he smiled more readily. "Thank you," she said suddenly. Elias looked up from his plate. "For what?" "For seeing something in me worth saving." Clara fingered the embroidered handkerchief she now carried always. "For giving me work to do. For making me feel useful again." "Clara." Elias set down his fork and looked at her directly. "You were never not worth saving. And useful." He gestured toward the window, beyond which their garden lay in neat, productive rows. "Look what you've accomplished in just a few weeks. That's not charity work, that's partnership." Partnership. The word hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither was quite ready to explore. But it felt right. Clara thought, whatever was growing between them. Friendship. Mutual respect. Something deeper. It was built on equal ground. She brought her knowledge and care to this place, and he brought his strength and stability. Together, they were creating something neither could have managed alone. Outside, the October wind rustled through the cottonwoods by the creek, carrying the scent of approaching winter. But inside the warm kitchen, with the taste of their own vegetables fresh on their tongues and the quiet satisfaction of shared accomplishment settling around them like a comfortable quilt, Clara felt something she hadn't experienced in months, the simple pleasure of being exactly where she belonged. The stranger arrived on a Tuesday morning when the November sky hung low and gray, threatening snow. Clara was in the garden, harvesting the last of the turnips before the ground froze hard, when she heard the sound of an approaching wagon. She looked up to see a man she didn't recognize driving a weather-beaten buckboard toward the house, his coat collar turned up against the cold wind. Elias emerged from the barn, a pitchfork still in his hands, and walked deliberately toward the approaching vehicle. There was something in his posture, a subtle tension, a readiness, that made Clara wheel her chair closer to the garden's edge so she could better see and hear what transpired. The stranger was a heavy-set man with thinning hair and the soft look of someone unaccustomed to hard labor. His clothes, though travel-stained, were of better quality than most folks in these parts could afford. When he climbed down from the wagon's seat, he did so with the careful movements of a man nursing old injuries or newer indulgences. "You Rowan?" the stranger called out, his voice carrying the nasal twang of someone from back east. "That's right." Elias didn't move closer, didn't offer any of the casual hospitality that was customary between neighbors. "What can I do for you?" "Name's Cornelius Whitmore. I'm here about my property." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. Whitmore, her late husband's surname, though she'd never heard Matthew mention anyone named Cornelius. She gripped the arms of her chair, her knuckles going white. "Don't believe I have anything that belongs to you," Elias said evenly. Cornelius reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper. "This here document says otherwise. Legal transfer of debt, signed by Jebediah Morse. Matthew Whitmore owed me considerable money, gambling debts, mostly. And when he died, that debt passed to his widow. Since she can't pay in coin, well..." He unfolded the paper with a theatrical flourish. "I'm here to collect my property." Clara felt the world tilt beneath her. Property. He was talking about her as if she were livestock, a piece of furniture to be repossessed. The careful life she'd built here, the sense of belonging she'd finally begun to feel, all of it suddenly seemed as fragile as morning frost. Elias set the pitchfork aside with deliberate care, his movements slow and controlled. "Mind if I have a look at that document?" Course not. All legal and proper, I assure you. Cornelius handed over the paper with obvious satisfaction. Had my lawyer in Topeka draw it up special. Clara watched Elias read the document, his face giving nothing away, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. When he handed the paper back, his voice was still calm, but there was something underneath it now, something cold and implacable. This says Clara Whitmore owes you $800. Plus interest, been accumulating for months now. And you're claiming you can take her as, what, payment? Cornelius shifted uncomfortably, perhaps sensing the dangerous undercurrent in Elias's tone. Well, not exactly take her, you understand, but she'd work off the debt. Housekeeping, cooking, that sort of thing. Got a big place in Kansas City, needs tending. I see. Elias folded his arms across his chest. And what exactly makes you think a woman can be used as collateral for a gambling debt? Now look here, Rowan, I know this seems harsh, but business is business. The woman's got no other way to pay what's owed. This arrangement benefits everyone. She gets a roof over her head. I get compensation for my losses. And you. Cornelius gestured vaguely toward Clara. Well, you get relieved of a burden, don't you? That was the wrong thing to say. Elias stepped forward, and suddenly the space between the two men seemed to shrink. Though Cornelius was the larger man, there was something about Elias in that moment, a stillness that spoke of controlled violence, of decisions already made that made the other man take an involuntary step backward. Here's what I think about your document, Elias said quietly. I think it's worth about as much as the paper it's written on. And I think you'd better climb back in that wagon and head back to wherever you came from. Now see here. No. The word cut through the air like a blade. You see here, this is my land, and Clara Whitmore is under my protection. Whatever debt you think existed died with her husband. In this territory, we don't trade in human beings, no matter what fancy papers you wave around. Cornelius's face flushed red. The law's on my side. Rowan, I can bring the sheriff out here if need be. You do that. Elias's hand moved almost casually to rest on the butt of his revolver. Bring Sheriff Morrison out here. Bring a judge if you can find one. But while you're at it, ask them what they think about a man who claims he owns another human being. Ask them how that sits with Kansas law. For the first time, Cornelius looked uncertain. The confidence that had carried him this far began to waver as he realized he might have misjudged both the situation and the man he was dealing with. The debt is real, he insisted, but his voice lacked conviction now. Matthew Whitmore lost fair and square in my gaming parlor. I got witnesses. Maybe he did, but Matthew Whitmore's dead, and his debts died with him. Clara doesn't owe you anything. And even if she did, no court in Kansas is going to let you claim a person as payment. Elias took another step forward. Now, you've got about 10 seconds to get off my property before I help you along. Clara had been silent through the entire exchange, partly from shock and partly from a lifetime of learning when to speak and when to let men settle their business. But now, seeing Cornelius's eyes dart toward her with a mixture of calculation and desperation, she found her voice. I never agreed to pay Matthew's debts, she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. And I certainly never agreed to indenture myself to you or anyone else. Both men turned to look at her, and Clara met Cornelius's gaze steadily. Whatever arrangement you made with Jebediah Morse, you made without my knowledge or consent. I'm not property to be transferred from one man to another. You're a woman with no means of support. Cornelius sputtered. You should be grateful for the opportunity to... To what? To be your unpaid servant? To work off a debt I never agreed to assume? Clara's voice grew stronger with each word. I'd rather starve in a ditch than accept such an arrangement. That can be arranged, Cornelius said nastily, his earlier pretense of civility falling away completely. It was the second wrong thing to say. Elias moved so quickly that Clara barely saw it happen. One moment he was standing several feet away from Cornelius. The next, he had the larger man backed against his wagon, one hand gripping the front of his coat. His voice, when he spoke, was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of absolute certainty. You just threatened a woman under my protection, in my yard, on my land. Each word was measured, deliberate. Now, I'm going to give you one chance to apologize to the lady and ride out of here. If you're not gone in the next 5 minutes, I'll assume you're trespassing with ill intent, and I'll respond accordingly. Cornelius's eyes widened as he saw something in Elias's face that convinced him this was not a bluff. This isn't over. Rowan, the law... The law protects people like Clara from people like you. Elias released his grip on the man's coat and stepped back. Clock's ticking. Cornelius glanced once more at Clara, as if calculating whether she might be worth the risk of pressing his claim. Whatever he saw in her face, or in Elias's unwavering stance, seemed to convince him otherwise. He climbed hastily into his wagon and gathered the reins. You haven't heard the last of this, he called out as he turned the wagon around. Yes, Elias said calmly. I have. They watched until the wagon disappeared over the rise, swallowed by the gray November landscape. Only then did the tension begin to drain from Elias's shoulders. He turned toward Clara, and she saw something in his expression she'd never seen before, a fierce protectiveness that took her breath away. You all right? He asked, walking toward her. Clara nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure it was true. The encounter had shaken her more than she wanted to admit, not just because of Cornelius's threats, but because of how quickly her newfound security had been challenged. Do you think he'll be back? Not if he's got any sense. Elias crouched down beside her chair, bringing himself to her eye level. Clara, I want you to know something. Whatever debts your husband may have left behind, they're not yours to carry, and as long as you're here, no one's going to treat you as anything less than a free woman with full rights and dignity. Even if it means trouble for you? Elias smiled then, the first real smile she'd seen from him all morning. Especially if it means trouble for me. Some things are worth fighting for. Clara felt tears prick at her eyes, not from fear or gratitude, but from something deeper. For the first time since Matthew's death, someone had stood up for her not out of pity or obligation, but out of genuine respect. Someone had seen her as worth defending. Thank you, she said quietly. Not just for sending him away, but for seeing me as a person worth protecting. Clara, Elias reached out and gently touched her hand. You're not just worth protecting, you're worth fighting for. And anyone who can't see that is either blind or a fool. As they sat there in the gray morning light, Clara realized something had shifted between them. What had begun as charity had become partnership, and partnership was growing into something deeper still. Cornelius Whitmore had come to claim her as property, but in defending her, Elias had affirmed something more precious than ownership, her inherent worth as a human being. The wind picked up, carrying the promise of winter, but Clara no longer felt the cold. She was home, and she was free, and she was protected by a man who saw her not as a burden to be borne, but as a treasure to be cherished. That, she thought, was worth all the turnips in Kansas. The idea came to Elias on a December morning when frost painted the world silver and Clara sat on the porch wrapped in quilts, watching him work with the horses. She'd been quieter since Cornelius Whitmore's visit, more withdrawn, as if the encounter had reminded her of all the things she could no longer do. It pained him to see the light dim in her eyes, the way she'd begun to decline his invitations to help with the smaller ranch tasks. Too much trouble, she'd say, or you'd be faster on your own, and Elias would let it pass rather than argue. But he saw how she watched him with the horses, the longing in her face when he saddled up to check the far pastures. Clara had been born to this land, raised on it, and being confined to the house and garden was like caging a bird that remembered flight. That morning, as he led Buttercup, his gentlest mare, back to the barn, an idea began to form. He spent the rest of the day in his workshop, sketching and measuring, working out angles and supports. By evening, he had a plan. "Clara," he said over supper, his voice carefully casual. "How long's it been since you rode a horse?" She looked up from her plate, surprised by the question. "Not since before the flood. Why?" "Just wondering." Elias cut another piece of cornbread. His movements deliberate. "Buttercup's getting soft with all this easy living. Thought she might benefit from more regular exercise." "She's a good horse," Clara agreed, though her voice carried a note of wistfulness. "Sweet-tempered. Matthew always said she had the most comfortable gait of any horse he'd ever ridden." "Still does. Shame to waste it." Clara set down her fork and studied his face. "Elias Rowan, what are you thinking?" "Thinking a lot of things. Thinking you miss being out on the land. Thinking there's no reason you can't still ride if we approach it right." He met her gaze directly. "Thinking I might know a way to make it work." Hope flickered in Clara's eyes before caution dampened it. "I can't feel my legs. Elias, can't grip with my knees or balance properly. It's not safe." "Maybe not the way you used to ride, but there might be another way." Elias leaned forward, his voice taking on the intensity it held when he was working through a problem. "What if we built something to help? A frame of some kind, to give you support and security?" Clara stared at him as if he'd suggested they harness the moon. "You think such a thing is possible?" "I think lots of things are possible if you're willing to work at them." Elias stood and began clearing the dishes. "Question is, are you willing to try?" For 3 weeks, Elias worked in secret, spending his evenings in the workshop, crafting something that had never existed before. He started with a modified saddle, reinforcing it with a high back and padded supports. Then came the tricky part, a system of straps and buckles that would hold Clara securely without restricting her movement entirely. The frame itself was made from lightweight but strong ash wood, curved to follow the contours of a rider's body and padded with sheepskin. Leather straps would secure it around Clara's waist and thighs, while a quick-release mechanism would allow her to dismount safely in an emergency. When he was satisfied with the construction, Elias tested it himself, adjusting the fit and checking every joint and buckle for weaknesses. Only when he was certain it would hold did he approach Clara with his creation. "I've been working on something," he said one morning after breakfast. "Like to show it to you, if you're willing." Clara followed him to the barn, curiosity overcoming her usual caution. When she saw what waited in the tack room, her hand flew to her mouth. "Oh, Elias," she breathed. "You made this? For me?" "Made it for us," he corrected. "So we can ride out together, check the far pastures, see the land the way it's meant to be seen." Clara wheeled closer to examine the contraption. Her fingers traced the smooth wood, tested the softness of the padding, explored the clever mechanism of the straps. "It's beautiful work, but will it actually—" "Only one way to find out." Elias lifted the modified saddle. "Buttercup's waiting in her stall, and the morning's calm. Perfect day for a first attempt." Clara's face cycled through hope, fear, and determination before settling on resolve. "All right, let's try." Preparing Buttercup took longer than usual. Elias spoke to the mare in soothing tones, letting her examine and smell the new equipment before securing it in place. The horse was curious but calm, her ears forward with interest rather than alarm. "She trusts you," Clara observed, watching from her chair. "She trusts the process." Elias replied, "Horses are smart that way. They can tell when something's being done with care." Getting Clara into the saddle required patience and several false starts. The first attempt ended with her sliding sideways, saved only by Elias's quick reflexes. The second went better, but the straps weren't quite right, leaving her feeling insecure and off balance. "This is foolish," Clara said after the third unsuccessful attempt, sweat beading on her forehead despite the December chill. "I'm going to get hurt, or hurt Buttercup, or both." "You're going to get it right," Elias said calmly, adjusting the frame's position. "Just needs fine-tuning. Nothing worthwhile comes easy on the first try." What if I fall? Elias paused in his adjustments and looked up at her. Then I'll be right here to catch you. And if I can't catch you, I'll fall with you. Either way, you won't be alone. Something in his voice, the absolute certainty, the unquestioning commitment, steadied Clara's nerves. She nodded and prepared to try again. The fourth attempt was better. The straps held her securely. The frame supported her properly. And when Elias led Buttercup forward a few steps, Clara remained balanced and upright. But when he suggested they try a longer walk around the corral, disaster struck. A sudden gust of wind blew a piece of loose hay across Buttercup's path. The mare shied slightly. Nothing dramatic, just a small sidestep, but it was enough to throw off Clara's precarious balance. She fell hard, landing in the dirt with a cry of pain and frustration. Elias was beside her in an instant, checking for injuries, his face pale with concern. "Clara, are you hurt? Can you feel anything broken?" She sat in the dirt, her riding skirt twisted around her legs, dirt smudged across her cheek. For a moment, Elias thought she might cry. Instead, she wiped her face with the back of her hand and looked up at him with blazing determination. "Again," she said. "Clara, maybe we should—" "Again." She struggled to push herself upright. "Help me back up there. Elias, I'm not finished." The fifth fall came when Buttercup stumbled slightly over an uneven patch of ground. The sixth happened when Clara leaned too far forward trying to pat the horse's neck. Each time, she picked herself up, brushed off the dirt, and demanded to try again. "You're getting scraped up pretty good," Elias observed after the seventh fall, noting the tears in her sleeves and the fresh bruises on her arms. "I've been scraped up before." Clara's jaw was set in a line he was beginning to recognize. "I can handle a little dirt and a few bruises." What impressed Elias most was not just her determination, but the way she approached each fall as a learning experience. She'd analyze what went wrong, adjust her position or her grip, and try a different approach the next time. There was no self-pity, no dramatic declarations about giving up, just steady, stubborn persistence. By the 10th attempt, she was staying mounted for longer periods. By the 15th, she could manage a complete circuit of the corral without falling. And on the 20th try, something clicked. Clara sat straight and secure in the modified saddle, moving with Buttercup's gait as if she'd been born to it. "Look at me!" she called to Elias, her voice bright with triumph and disbelief. "Look at me! I'm riding!" Elias stood at the center of the corral, holding the lead rope, and watched Clara circle him with growing confidence. Her face was streaked with dirt and sweat. Her hair had come loose from its pins, and her dress was torn in 3 places. She was, he thought, the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. "How does it feel?" he called out. "Like flying," Clara laughed, the sound carrying pure joy. "Like I could ride all the way to California and back." They practiced for another hour, until both Clara and Buttercup were tired but satisfied. When Elias finally helped her down from the saddle, Clara's legs were shaking with exhaustion, but her eyes shone with accomplishment. "Thank you," she said as he settled her back into her chair. "For building this, for believing it could work, for not giving up when I kept falling." "You're the one who didn't give up," Elias pointed out. "All I did was hold the rope." "No." Clara reached out and caught his hand. "You did much more than that. You gave me back something I thought I'd lost forever." That evening, as they sat by the fire, nursing their various aches and bruises, Clara was more animated than Elias had seen her since her arrival. She talked about where they might ride next, what parts of the ranch she wanted to see, how good it had felt to be moving across the land under her own power again. "I'd forgotten what it was like," she said, staring into the flames. "To feel capable, to feel like I could do something difficult and master it." "You were always capable," Elias said quietly. "You just needed the right tools and someone willing to catch you when you fell." Clara looked at him across the flickering firelight, and something passed between them that went beyond gratitude or friendship. It was recognition, of partnership, of shared purpose, of two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed. "When I was falling," she said softly, "I wasn't afraid, not really, because I knew you'd be there. Always," Elias replied, and meant it with every fiber of his being. "For as long as you'll have me, I'll always be there to catch you." Outside, the December wind howled across the prairie, but inside their small circle of warmth and light, Clara and Elias sat content in the knowledge that some things, trust, determination, the willingness to fall and rise again, were stronger than any storm the world could send their way. The opportunity came on a bitter January morning when the wind cut across the prairie like a knife and snow threatened in the iron-gray sky. Elias had been planning the trip to Lawrence for weeks. The ranch needed supplies before the worst of winter set in, and he had business with the bank regarding spring seed money. "I'll be gone most of the day," he told Clara over breakfast, his voice carrying the reluctance it always held when duty called him away from the ranch. "Maybe into evening if the weather turns bad. You sure you'll be all right here alone?" Clara looked up from her eggs, noting the concern in his voice. In the months since she'd arrived, Elias had rarely left the ranch for more than a few hours, and never overnight. She could see it cost him something to even consider leaving her. "I'll be fine," she assured him. "I've got plenty to keep me busy, mending to catch up on, and I want to work on that quilt pattern I've been planning." "Keep the doors locked," Elias said, more serious now. "Winchester's loaded and hanging over the mantel, and there's a box of shells in the kitchen drawer. You remember how to—" "I remember." Clara's voice was gentle but firm. "My father taught me to shoot when I was 12, and I haven't forgotten, but nothing's going to happen. Elias, this is probably the safest place in 3 counties. Elias nodded, but Clara could see he wasn't entirely convinced. "If anything seems off, anything at all, you fire 3 shots in the air. Sound carries far on days like this, and the Morrison place is only 2 miles east. They'll come running." After he left, driving the heavily loaded wagon toward town, Clara settled into the peaceful routine of a day alone. She worked on her mending by the front window, where she could watch the road and enjoy the pale winter sunlight. The house felt different without Elias's steady presence, quieter, somehow more fragile, but not unpleasantly so. It was, she reflected, rather nice to have time to think her own thoughts without worrying about conversation or company. The riders appeared around midday, just as Clara was considering breaking for lunch. 3 men on horseback, moving with the purposeful pace of people who knew exactly where they were going. She watched them approach with mild curiosity that gradually sharpened into unease. They weren't neighbors. She knew all the local families by now, and their clothes and gear had the rough, mismatched look of men who lived on the margins of respectable society. Clara wheeled away from the window and considered her options. Elias had been right to worry. It seemed, but panicking wouldn't help anyone. She moved quickly to the kitchen, retrieved the box of ammunition from the drawer, and wheeled herself to the fireplace where the Winchester hung on its wooden pegs. Getting the rifle down from the mantel while seated in her chair required some maneuvering, but Clara managed it without dropping either the weapon or herself. The familiar weight of the gun in her hands was oddly comforting. Solid, reliable, equalizing. She checked the action, confirmed it was loaded, and positioned herself where she could see the front yard while remaining concealed behind the curtained window. The men had stopped near the barn and were examining Elias's horses with obvious interest. The leader, a tall, lanky man with a scraggly beard, pointed toward the corral where Buttercup and 2 other mares stood watching the strangers with nervous attention. The second man, shorter but broader, began working his way around the barn toward the back, while the third headed for the chicken coop. Horse thieves. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands remained steady on the rifle. They thought the place was empty, probably figured Elias was gone and wouldn't return for hours. They were right about Elias being gone, but wrong about the place being undefended. The leader was now examining the gate to the main corral, clearly calculating how quickly they could get the horses loaded and moving. The short man had disappeared behind the barn, probably checking for other livestock or anything else worth stealing. The third was chasing chickens around the yard with more enthusiasm than skill. Clara made her decision. She opened the front door just wide enough to poke the rifle barrel through, took careful aim at the ground near the leader's feet, and squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked across the yard like thunder, sending up a spray of frozen dirt inches from the man's boots. He leaped backward with a startled curse, his own gun appearing in his hand with surprising speed as he scanned the area for the source of the shot. "Next one won't miss," Clara called out, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. "Mount up and ride out, or I'll put holes in all three of you." The leader's eyes found the partially open door and the rifle barrel protruding from it. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, though he was smart enough not to lower his weapon. "Looks like somebody's home after all, boys." His companions emerged from their respective hiding places, the chicken thief now empty-handed and looking considerably less confident than he had moments before. "Ma'am," the leader called out, his voice taking on a tone of false reasonableness. "No need for shooting. We're just travelers looking for directions. Didn't mean no harm." "Travelers who examine other people's livestock real careful-like," Clara replied dryly. "And who split up to search a man's property without permission. I may be stuck in this chair, but I'm not stupid." She had their attention now. All three men focused on the house rather than their original mission. That was good. It meant they were taking her seriously as a threat, but it also meant they were thinking, calculating, probably trying to figure out if one woman with a rifle could really stop three armed men. "Listen here, lady," the short man called out, emboldened by his companion's presence. "We ain't looking for trouble with you. Just need to borrow a couple horses. We'll bring 'em back real soon." "No, you won't." Clara adjusted her aim slightly, centering the rifle on the man's chest. "Because you're not taking anything from this ranch. Not horses, not chickens, not so much as a nail from that fence post." The third man, young, probably not more than 20, with the nervous energy of someone trying to prove himself, took a step toward the house. "Oh, hell, it's just some crippled woman. What's she gonna do? Shoot all three of us?" It was exactly the wrong thing to say. Clara's second shot took the hat clean off his head, sending it spinning into the dirt behind him. The young man yelped and dove for cover behind the water trough, his earlier bravado evaporating like morning mist. "That answer your question?" Clara asked pleasantly. The leader was reassessing the situation now, his eyes moving from the house to his spooked companions to the horses they'd come to steal. Clara could practically see him working the angles, trying to decide if the potential gain was worth the very real risk of facing a woman who could put a bullet exactly where she wanted it. "You're a fair shot," he admitted. "But you gotta reload sometime, and there's three of us. Might be you should reconsider our offer. Might be you should count again." Clara replied. She fired her third shot. This one aimed at the fence post directly between the leader and the short man. Both men jumped, and she smoothly worked the rifle's lever action, chambering another round. "Winchester holds 15 cartridges, and I've got a whole box more in here with me. Question is, how many of you are willing to bet I can't reload faster than you can rush this house?" The silence that followed was broken only by the wind and the nervous whickering of the horses. Clara kept the rifle trained on the leader, but her peripheral vision tracked the other two men. The young one was still crouched behind the water trough, apparently rethinking his career choices. The short man had his gun drawn, but seemed reluctant to use it against a woman, even one who was demonstrably capable of defending herself. "Boys," the leader said finally, his voice tight with frustrated anger. "Seems like the lady's not inclined to be neighborly. Maybe we ought to try our luck elsewhere." "But Jake," the young man protested, raising his head above the trough. "We came all this way, and them's fine horses." Clara's fourth shot sent splinters flying from the edge of the trough, missing the young man's face by mere inches. He dropped back down with a strangled cry. "Jake's giving you good advice." Clara called out, "I'd take it if I were you. Next man who pokes his head up is going to get more than splinters to worry about." The leader, Jake, holstered his weapon with obvious reluctance. "All right, lady, you win this round, but you might want to think about what happens when you're here alone again. Word gets around about a place with good horses and only a crippled woman to guard them. Word also gets around about a woman who can shoot the buttons off a man's coat at 50 yards. Clara replied calmly. "And about thieves who got run off by someone they thought was helpless. Might affect your reputation some." Jake's face darkened at the implied threat to his standing among his criminal peers. But Clara's rifle was still trained on him, and he was smart enough to recognize when he was outgunned, literally and figuratively. "Mount up," he told his companions. "We're leaving." The three men retreated to their horses with as much dignity as they could muster, which wasn't much. As they rode away, the young man kept looking back over his shoulder as if he couldn't quite believe what had just happened. Clara maintained her position at the window until they disappeared over the ridge, then carefully lowered the rifle and allowed herself to breathe properly for the first time in 20 minutes. Her hands were shaking now, delayed reaction to the confrontation, but they'd been steady when it mattered. She reloaded the Winchester's magazine, returned it to its place over the mantel, and wheeled herself to the kitchen to make coffee. She had a feeling she was going to need it. Elias returned just as the sun was setting, his wagon loaded with supplies and his face showing the strain of a long day in town, followed by a cold drive home. Clara met him at the door, and something in her expression made him stop short. "What happened?" he asked, scanning her face for signs of trouble. "Had some visitors today," Clara said calmly. "3 men with an interest in your horses. I discouraged them." Elias's eyes went immediately to the Winchester over the mantel, noting that it had been moved from its usual position. "Are you all right? Did they hurt you?" "I'm fine. They didn't get close enough to hurt anything but their pride." Clara smiled, and there was something fierce in the expression. "Remind me to thank you for keeping that rifle in good working order." Elias sank into a chair, the full implications of what might have happened washing over him. "Jesus, Clara, what if they'd rushed the house? What if there'd been more of them?" "Then I'd have shot as many as I could and trusted the rest would lose their enthusiasm for horse stealing." Clara poured coffee for both of them, her movements calm and sure. "But it didn't come to that. They decided their business lay elsewhere." "You could have been killed." "So could you. Every time you ride out to check the cattle. So could anyone. Doing anything." Clara settled her chair beside his and handed him the steaming cup. "Point is, I wasn't killed. I protected what's ours. And I sent a message that this ranch isn't as easy a target as some folks might think." Elias looked at her, really looked at her, and saw something that made his chest tight with emotions he couldn't quite name. Pride, certainly, gratitude. But more than that, a recognition of the strength that had always been there, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. "Remind me never to get on your bad side," he said, and his smile held nothing but admiration. "You're safe," Clara replied, returning the smile. "You don't steal my chickens." Outside, the wind continued its restless song across the prairie, but inside the warm house, surrounded by the comfortable evidence of their shared life, Clara and Elias sat in perfect understanding. She had proven herself capable of defending their home, and he had learned something important about the woman who shared it with him. Some partnerships, they both realized, were forged not just in kindness and mutual respect, but in the crucible of crisis, and theirs had just grown stronger than either of them had imagined possible. The storm came on a February night when the wind howled like something alive and angry, driving snow against the windows in sheets so thick that the world beyond disappeared entirely. Clara had seen Kansas blizzards before, but this one felt different, more violent, more personal, as if the winter itself bore some grudge against anyone foolish enough to challenge it. She and Elias had spent the day preparing, bringing in extra firewood, checking that the animals had adequate shelter, securing anything that might blow away. By evening, they were as ready as they could be, but the storm's fury still caught them off guard. The wind shook the house like a giant's hand, and somewhere in the darkness, they could hear the crash of something. A tree branch, perhaps, or part of the barn roof, giving way under the assault. "Never seen one quite like this," Elias said, standing at the kitchen window and trying to peer through the whirling snow. "Temperatures dropping fast, too. Going to be a hard night for anything caught outside." Clara looked up from the socks she was darning by lamplight. "The animals are secure?" "As secure as I can make them. Barn solid. And I moved the chickens into the root cellar for extra protection. But if this keeps up..." He left the sentence unfinished, but Clara understood. There were limits to what any man could do against nature's fury. The power of the storm seemed to press in on them, making the warm house feel smaller, more fragile. They went through their evening routine quietly, both aware of the violence raging just beyond their walls. By the time they'd finished the dishes and banked the fire for the night, the snow was piling against the windows, and the wind had taken on a keening note that made Clara's nerves feel raw. "Don't think I'll sleep much tonight," Elias admitted as they prepared to retire to their respective rooms. "Storm like this, sometimes things go wrong fast." "Then don't try to sleep," Clara said. "Stay up. Keep watch if it makes you feel better. I can do the same." Elias looked at her thoughtfully. "Might be good to have company on a night like this. You sure you don't mind?" "I'd prefer it. Actually, something about this storm." Clara shivered despite the warmth of the room. "It feels like the kind of night when people should stick together." So they settled in the main room. Clara in her chair near the fire, and Elias in the wooden rocker he'd inherited with the house. The lamplight cast dancing shadows on the walls. And outside, the storm raged with undiminished fury. For a long while, they sat in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. It was Elias who spoke first, his voice quiet against the backdrop of wind and driven snow. "I was thinking about the night my mother died," he said, staring into the fire. "Storm not unlike this one. Maybe not as fierce, but just as cold. I was 17. Thought I knew everything there was to know about taking care of myself in the place." Clara set aside her mending and gave him her full attention. In all the months she'd lived here, Elias had shared very little about his past, his family, the experiences that had shaped him into the man he'd become. "She'd been sick for weeks," he continued. "Lung fever, the doctor said, though he couldn't do much about it except tell me to keep her warm and comfortable. I tried everything I could think of, extra blankets, hot soup, tea with honey, but she just kept getting weaker." The fire popped and settled, sending up a shower of sparks. Elias watched them fade before continuing. "Night she died. She called me to her bedside, could barely speak by then, but she managed to tell me something I've never forgotten. Said the hardest thing about dying wasn't leaving this world, it was leaving me alone in it. Said she'd failed me by not teaching me how to live with other people, how to let them close enough to matter." Clara felt her throat tighten. "She hadn't failed you, Elias. You're one of the finest men I've ever known." "Maybe now, but for 10 years after she passed, I did exactly what she was afraid I'd do. Kept to myself, kept everyone at arm's length, told myself I was being independent, self-sufficient. Truth was, I was scared. Scared of caring about someone and losing them the way I'd lost her." He looked up from the fire then, meeting Clara's eyes directly. Scared of the kind of pain that comes when someone you love is taken away. Clara understood that fear better than he knew. After Matthew died, I felt the same way. Not just because of losing him, but because of how helpless I was afterward. How completely I depended on him for everything, security, purpose, even my sense of who I was. When he was gone. She paused, searching for the right words. I felt like I'd lost myself along with him. "But you found yourself again," Elias said softly. "Here, On this ranch, in that garden, defending this place when those men came. You found who you really are when everything else was stripped away. With your help, Clara replied. With your patience and faith and stubborn refusal to see me as anything less than whole. The wind gusted harder, rattling the windows and sending snow down the chimney in a brief hiss of steam. Both of them looked toward the sound, reminded of the storm's presence. Before their attention returned to each other, "Clara," Elias said, and something in his tone made her pulse quicken. "There's something I need to tell you, something I've been working up the courage to say for weeks now." She waited, not trusting herself to speak. "When I brought you home from that market, I thought I was doing a good deed, helping someone who needed help, maybe easing my own conscience in the process. I never expected—" He ran a hand through his hair, struggling with words that seemed inadequate for what he was trying to express. "Never expected what?" "Never expected you to change everything. The way this house feels, the way I think about the future, the way I think about myself. You've made me want things I'd convinced myself I didn't need. Made me remember what it feels like to have someone to come home to. Someone whose smile can make the worst day bearable." Clara's heart was beating so hard she was sure he must be able to hear it. "Elias." "I know I've got no right to ask for more than what we already have," he continued, the words coming faster now, as if he was afraid he'd lose his nerve if he stopped. "You've been through enough without having to deal with the feelings of some lonely rancher. But on a night like this, with the world trying to tear itself apart outside, I can't help but think about what really matters. And what matters to me is you." The confession hung between them like something tangible, charged with possibility and risk. Clara felt tears prick at her eyes, not from sadness, but from a rush of emotions too complex to name. "You think you have no right?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Elias, you saved my life, not just from Jebediah's wagon or Cornelius's threats, but from believing I was worthless. You gave me back my dignity, my purpose, my sense of who I could be. If anyone has earned the right to speak honestly about feelings, it's you." Hope flickered in his eyes, but uncertainty remained. "And what do you feel, Clara? When you look at me, what do you see?" Clara wheeled her chair closer to his, close enough to reach out and take his hands in hers. They were work-roughened hands, scarred from years of ranch labor, but gentle despite their strength. Safe hands, hands that had never hurt her, never taken more than they were freely given. "I see the man who built me a garden when I thought I'd never grow anything again," she said, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "I see the man who crafted a way for me to ride again when everyone else, including me, thought it was impossible. I see someone who stands between me and the world's cruelty. Not because he pities me, but because he values me." She paused, gathering courage for the words that would change everything between them. "I see the man I love," she said simply. "The man I want to build a life with, if he'll have me." The change in Elias's face was like watching the sun rise. Wonder, joy, relief, and something deeper. A recognition of coming home after a long journey through unfamiliar territory. "Clara," he breathed, and then he was out of his chair and kneeling beside hers, his hands framing her face with infinite gentleness. "Are you sure? Are you absolutely certain? Because once you say it, once we cross this line, I'll never be able to let you go." "I don't want you to let me go," Clara replied, leaning into his touch. "I want you to hold on as tight as you can and never stop." When he kissed her, it was with the reverence of a man who had been given something precious beyond measure. Clara felt herself melt into him, into the warmth and strength and steady certainty he represented. This was what she'd been missing without knowing it, not just companionship or partnership, but this deeper recognition of souls that had found their match. They held each other as the storm raged outside. Two people who had learned the hard way that love was not weakness but the greatest strength of all. They had both lost much: family, security, the easy confidence of youth. But in finding each other, They had discovered something worth more than everything they'd sacrificed. "You know what this means," Elias said eventually, his forehead resting against hers. "Tell me." "Means I'll never have another peaceful moment worrying about you. Means every time you're out of my sight, I'll be thinking about all the ways the world could try to hurt you. Means I'll probably hover and fuss and drive you half crazy with my protective instincts." Clara laughed, the sound bright and free in the storm-darkened room. "And you know what that means?" "What?" "Means you're going to have to trust me to take care of myself sometimes. Trust that I'm stronger than I look, smarter than people assume, and more capable than even I sometimes believe." She smiled up at him, her eyes sparkling with mischief and determination. "Think you can manage that? With you to help me learn, I think I can manage anything." Outside, the storm continued its assault on the Kansas prairie, but neither Clara nor Elias paid it much attention anymore. They had found something that no amount of wind or snow could touch, a love built on mutual respect, shared struggle, and the kind of deep understanding that comes only to those who have faced their worst fears and emerged stronger for the experience. They were no longer two lonely people taking shelter together. They were partners in the truest sense, bound not by desperation or convenience, but by choice. And that choice, made freely in the wild heart of a February blizzard, would prove stronger than any storm the world could send their way. Spring came early to Kansas that year, arriving with unexpected warmth and the kind of soft rains that coaxed green shoots from the winter-hardened earth. Clara woke one morning in late March to find Elias already at work in the yard, constructing something tall and wooden near the edge of her garden. "What are you building?" she called from the porch, still wrapped in her morning shawl against the cool air. Elias looked up from his hammering, a smile creasing his weathered face. "Something I should have built months ago," he said. "Something that'll grow tall enough to see from miles away." Curious, Clara wheeled herself closer. The structure was taking shape as a series of tall poles arranged in a careful pattern, with crossbeams and what looked like chicken wire stretched between them. It wasn't until she saw him positioning the first of many small wooden boxes along the base that she understood. "A trellis for climbing plants," she breathed. "But what are you planning to grow?" "Sunflowers," Elias said, his voice carrying a note of shy pride. "Remembered you mentioning they were your favorite. Thought maybe this year we could have a whole wall of them, something beautiful to look at, something that would make this place feel more like home." Clara felt her throat tighten with emotion. In all the months they'd been together, through all the quiet moments of growing closeness, he'd been listening, storing away the small details that mattered to her, planning ways to bring joy into her life. "They'll be magnificent," she said softly. "But sunflowers that tall, they'll be visible for miles around. People will see them and know this is a place where beautiful things are allowed to grow." "Good," Elias replied, meeting her eyes. "Let them see. Let them know this is a home where love lives." The work on the sunflower trellis became a shared project over the following weeks. Clara contributed her knowledge of spacing and soil preparation, while Elias provided the muscle for the heavier construction. They planted the seeds together on a warm April morning, Clara dropping the large seeds into carefully prepared holes while Elias covered them with rich earth. "Seems like faith, doesn't it?" Clara observed as they worked. "Putting something so small into the ground and trusting it to become something magnificent." "Best kind of faith there is," Elias agreed. "The kind based on knowing what's possible when conditions are right." As the sunflowers began to sprout and grow, other changes were taking shape around the ranch. Word had somehow gotten out, perhaps through Sheriff Morrison or the folks in Lawrence, that Elias Rowan's place was a refuge for those with nowhere else to turn. It started with a widow named Sarah Hutchins, whose husband had died in a mining accident, leaving her with 2 young children and no means of support. "Just for a few weeks," she pleaded when she appeared at their door one morning, her children clinging to her skirts. "Until I can figure out what to do next." Clara and Elias exchanged a look, and without words, the decision was made. Stay as long as you need, Clara said, wheeling herself forward to take the woman's work-worn hands. We'll figure something out together. Sarah was followed by old Benjamin Porter, whose grown children had moved west and left him alone with failing eyesight and trembling hands. Then came the Kowalski family, recent immigrants whose dreams of farming had been shattered by drought and debt. Each arrival brought its own challenges, but also its own gifts. Sarah proved to be an excellent cook. Benjamin had a wealth of knowledge about animal husbandry, and the Kowalskis brought strong backs and willing hearts. Clara found herself naturally taking on the role of organizer and record keeper for their growing community. She kept a careful ledger of who had arrived when, what skills they brought, what had made them smile for the first time since finding shelter at the ranch. The entries painted a picture of resilience and gradual healing. Asterisk Sarah Hutchins, April 15th, cried when she saw the children's room we prepared. First smile came when little Tommy caught his first fish in Willow Creek. Asterisk Benjamin Porter, April 22nd, nearly blind but can still shoe a horse better than anyone in 3 counties. Smiled when Clara asked his advice about breeding plans for the mares. Asterisk Kowalski family, May 3rd. Yosef speaks little English but understands kindness in any language. Anna smiled when she saw the vegetable garden and realized she could contribute by expanding it. The sunflowers grew throughout the spring and into summer, reaching heights that amazed even Clara, who had grown them before. By July, they stood 12 feet tall, their massive golden heads following the sun's path across the sky like living compasses. True to Elias's prediction, they could be seen from miles away, drawing curious visitors and serving as a beacon for those who needed hope. It was during the second week of July, as Clara sat in the garden teaching little Tommy Hutchins how to identify ripe tomatoes, that she noticed something different about herself, a subtle change in her energy, a new awareness of her body that made her pause and consider. That evening, after the household had settled for the night, she approached Elias as he sat on the porch watching the sunflowers sway in the gentle breeze. "There's something I need to tell you," she said, maneuvering her chair beside his rocker. Elias looked at her, noting something in her tone that made him give her his full attention. "What is it?" Clara took his hand, pressing it gently. I believe we're going to have a child." The words hung in the evening air like something miraculous. Elias stared at her, his face cycling through surprise, wonder, and finally, pure joy. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "As certain as I can be. I've felt this way before, though it was years ago, and—" Clara's voice faltered slightly. "Matthew and I lost 2 babies early on. I never told you because it seemed like old pain, not worth revisiting." Elias knelt beside her chair and gathered her into his arms, holding her with infinite gentleness. "This is different," he said fiercely. "This child will be born into love and safety and a home full of people who will cherish it. Whatever happened before doesn't matter now." Clara allowed herself to be held, to absorb his certainty and strength. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Scared something will go wrong. Scared I won't be able to care for a baby properly from this chair. Scared." "Hey," Elias pulled back to look at her face. "Remember what you told me about the sunflowers? About faith being trust in what's possible when conditions are right?" Clara nodded. "Conditions are right. Clara, we've got love. We've got a home. We've got a whole community of people who'll help us raise this child. And most importantly, we've got you, the strongest, most capable woman I've ever known. If anyone can do this, it's you." As summer progressed, Clara found that her pregnancy was progressing normally despite her initial fears. Dr. Harrison from Lawrence, summoned for a consultation, pronounced her and the baby healthy and expressed cautious optimism about the outcome. "The injury to your legs doesn't affect the relevant functions," he explained kindly. "There's no reason you can't carry and deliver a healthy child." The news spread through their small community like wildfire, bringing an extra note of celebration to the daily routines. Sarah Hutchins immediately appointed herself Clara's assistant, insisting on taking over the heavier household tasks. Anna Kowalski began sewing tiny clothes with the same meticulous care she brought to everything. Even Benjamin Porter contributed, crafting a beautiful wooden cradle from oak he'd been saving for a special project. It was in early August, as Clara sat among the towering sunflowers updating her ledger of residents and their stories, that an unwelcome visitor appeared on the horizon. Cornelius Whitmore was back, this time accompanied by two hard-looking men who rode with the casual authority of hired guns. Clara felt her stomach clench with more than pregnancy-related discomfort as she watched the trio approach. She called out to Elias, who emerged from the barn with Joseph Kowalski and Benjamin Porter flanking him. Word spread quickly through the ranch, and within minutes, their entire community had gathered in the yard. Men, women, and children united in their determination to protect what they'd built together. "Well, well," Cornelius called out as he dismounted. "Quite the little operation you've got here. Rowan, playing Lord of the Manor to a bunch of strays and misfits." "State your business and move on," Elias replied coldly. "You're not welcome here. My business is with her." Cornelius pointed at Clara, his eyes bright with malice. "Heard interesting news in town. Seems the widow's expecting. Now, that changes things considerably." Clara felt Elias tense beside her, but she spoke before he could respond. "Changes nothing. My child has nothing to do with you or any imaginary debt you think I owe." "Child of a debtor belongs to the creditor under territorial law," one of Cornelius's companions said, his hand resting casually on his gun butt. "Old law, but still on the books." "That," came a new voice from behind them, "is complete nonsense." Everyone turned to see Sheriff Morrison riding into the yard, flanked by two deputies. The lawman dismounted with deliberate slowness, his badge catching the afternoon sunlight. "Afternoon, folks," Morrison said pleasantly, though his eyes never left Cornelius and his men. "Heard there might be some legal confusion that needed clearing up." "Sheriff," Cornelius said, his earlier confidence wavering slightly, "this is a private matter." "No such thing when it involves threats against Kansas citizens," Morrison interrupted, "especially when those threats are based on laws that don't exist. See, I took the trouble to wire the territorial court about your claims. Mr. Whitmore. Turns out there's no such thing as inheritable gambling debt in Kansas law, and children certainly can't be claimed as payment for anything." Cornelius's face flushed red. "But the document." "The document you showed me last time?" Morrison smiled grimly. "Had my lawyer friend look at that too. Turns out forged legal papers are a federal crime. Now, you can ride out of here peacefully, or I can arrest you and your friends for attempted fraud, trespassing, and making threats against a pregnant woman. Your choice." The confrontation deflated like a punctured balloon. Cornelius looked around the yard at the assembled faces, men and women who had found refuge here, who had built something worth defending. He saw no sympathy, no support, only unified opposition to his presence. "This isn't over," he muttered, but the words lacked conviction. "Yes, it is," Clara said clearly. "It's been over since the day you first came here thinking you could treat people like property. The difference is, now you know it too." As Cornelius and his men rode away, this time, Clara was certain, for good, the community that had gathered to defend her began to disperse back to their various tasks. But the feeling of solidarity, of shared purpose, lingered in the air like the scent of the sunflowers. That evening, as Clara and Elias sat together watching the sunset paint the massive flowers in shades of gold and amber, she placed his hand on her growing belly. "Feel that?" she asked as the baby shifted restlessly. "Strong," Elias murmured wonderingly. "Already strong, like its mother." "Like both its parents," Clara corrected. "This child is going to grow up knowing it's loved, knowing it belongs somewhere, knowing that home isn't a place but the people who choose to love you." As if in response to her words, the baby kicked vigorously, making both parents laugh. Around them, the sounds of their extended family drifted on the evening air. Sarah calling her children in for baths. Benjamin telling stories to anyone who would listen. The Kowalskis singing softly in their native language. "You know what I'm most grateful for?" Clara asked as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "Tell me." "That no one wanted the paralyzed widow," she said, her voice full of wonder at how completely her life had changed. "Because if someone had, I might never have found my way here, might never have discovered what I was really capable of, or met the man who would teach me that love isn't about being rescued. It's about choosing to be strong together." Elias leaned over to kiss her gently, his hand still resting protectively on their unborn child. "Then I'm grateful too. Grateful for Kansas floods and market days and stubborn women who refuse to be anything less than magnificent." Above them, the sunflowers rustled in the night breeze, their faces turned toward the stars now that the sun had set, and in the house that love had built, surrounded by the family that circumstance had created and choice had cemented, Clara and Elias planned for a future that promised to be as bright and enduring as the golden flowers that had become their banner of hope. The paralyzed widow had become a mother, a partner, a pillar of strength for an entire community. And the lonely rancher had discovered that some things, love, family, the bonds forged in adversity, were indeed stronger than he would ever be alone. Together, they were unbreakable.